Welcome back to Velvet Echoes. If this is your first time here, I'm so glad you found us. Before we get into tonight's story, drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. We've got listeners from Vancouver to Halifax and everywhere in between, and I love knowing where you all are. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button. New stories go up every week, and you don't want to miss what's coming. Now, get comfortable, because tonight's story is one of those that starts quietly and ends with everyone in the room holding their breath. She set down her champagne flute so gently that the stem didn't even clink against the table. That was the moment, not the gasp that came later, not the look on her husband's face when the lights found her at the top of the staircase. It was that one small, precise gesture. The way Victoria Ashford placed that glass down, like she was setting a chess piece, like she already knew every move left in the game and was simply waiting for the board to catch up with her. The woman standing across the ballroom, wearing the Ashford brooch, had no idea. Nobody did. Not yet. Victoria Ashford had turned 47 the previous March in a hotel suite in Montreal that her husband Preston had booked. As a surprise, he'd ordered her favorite wine, a Burgundy she'd mentioned once, 2 years earlier, at a dinner she barely remembered. He'd arranged for peonies, which she loved, and for a private dinner with a view of the St. Lawrence. He had remembered everything correctly. She had smiled through the whole evening and told herself that was enough. It wasn't that Preston was cruel. He wasn't. He was attentive in the way that men sometimes become attentive when they are hiding something. A kind of hyper-competence in the small things that quietly compensates for the catastrophic thing they are not saying. Victoria had noticed it the way she noticed most things, without reacting, without giving any sign that she'd noticed at all. She was good at that. She had grown up in a family where you didn't say what you felt. You observed. You catalogued. You waited until you were certain, until you had not just evidence but a complete picture, and then, only then, did you move. Her mother used to say that patience was not a virtue. It was a weapon. Victoria had sharpened hers for 22 years. She'd met Preston Ashford at a charity gala in Toronto, which felt, in retrospect, like the universe, having a quiet laugh at her expense. He'd been 31 and charming in that particular way that men with inherited money and earned ambition often are. She'd been 25, just finishing her master's in art history, working part-time at a Yorkville gallery, and wearing her one good dress. He had asked her about the piece hanging behind the bar, a mid-century lithograph that the event organizer had obviously just grabbed from a catalog, and she had told him exactly what it was, what it wasn't, and why it was hanging at the wrong height. He laughed. He said he'd never met anyone who could be both that precise and that devastating at the same time. They were married 14 months later. For a long time, it was good. She was honest about that, even now. Preston was ambitious and she was sharp, and together they built something real. Not just money, though there was plenty of that, but a genuine life. A house in Forest Hill, they adjured themselves, Bay, an understanding between them that ran deeper than affection. They had no children. That had been a slow grief, private and never fully spoken, and Victoria believed, still believed, that it had changed something in Preston. Not that he blamed her, but grief reshapes people in ways they don't always understand themselves, and sometimes a man who cannot name his own wound starts looking for relief in the wrong places. She didn't excuse it, she simply understood it. Understanding was not the same as forgiving. She knew that too. She had found out about Renee 6 months before the Alderton Foundation Gala. Not by accident and not by intuition, by method. Victoria had noticed the credit card statements first. Not because she went looking, but because she handled their household accounts herself, always had, and there were charges at a hotel on King Street West that Preston had never mentioned. A restaurant she knew was intimate, expensive, the kind of place you took someone you were trying to impress. Twice in 1 month, then 3 times. She hired a private investigator named Frank Beaumont, a former OPP officer, who had a small office above a dry cleaner in Etobicoke and the most boring website she had ever seen. He was methodical and discreet, and completely lacking in theatrics, which was exactly why she chose him. Frank gave her a folder 4 weeks later. She read it at the kitchen table with her coffee, like she was reading the newspaper. Renee Thibault, 29. Event planner. Worked freelance, which meant she moved in the same circles. The galas, the charity dinners, the launches. She was by every account bright and genuinely lovely, and Victoria felt something complicated when she looked at the photographs. Not hatred, more like a kind of exhausted recognition. The girl didn't know she was in the middle of a marriage. Victoria was almost certain of that. Almost. What she was completely certain of was this. In the bottom of the folder, tucked between the last two photographs, was a printed receipt. A jeweler on Queen Street West, Delacroix & Sons, the kind of place that didn't advertise because it didn't need to. The item, one Edwardian-era gold and sapphire lapel pin, formerly belonging to one Margaret Ashford née Colville, Victoria's mother-in-law, except Margaret Ashford had given that pin to Victoria, not to the Ashford family. To Victoria personally, with a note in her careful handwriting that said, "For when you need to remember, you belong somewhere." Margaret had died the previous autumn. Preston had cried at the funeral in a way Victoria had rarely seen him cry, openly, without composure. She had held his hand for the entire service. She had loved him that day more than she had in years. The pin had been in her jewelry cabinet, in its original velvet box. Until it wasn't. Victoria closed the folder. She finished her coffee. She sat for a while in the kitchen of the house she had spent 12 years making into a home, and she let herself feel the full weight of what had been taken from her. Not just the object, but the meaning of it, the specific cruelty of that particular choice. Then she picked up the phone and called her lawyer. The Alderton Foundation Gala was the event of the Toronto season. It was held each year at the Fairmont Royal York, in the ballroom that still had its original plasterwork, and it raised money for arts education programs across Ontario. Victoria was on the foundation board. She had been for 11 years. Preston had told her 3 weeks before the gala that he would be attending a conference in Calgary that week. He'd shown her the registration confirmation. He had looked her in the eye when he said it. She had said, "That's a shame. I always love having you there." She had already confirmed through Frank that Preston had purchased 2 tickets to the Alderton Gala under a corporate account. She rarely checked. That was fine. She had adjusted her plan accordingly. Her dress was a deep midnight blue, the kind of color that did nothing to announce itself and everything to command a room. She wore her mother's pearl earrings and kept her other jewelry minimal. Bare neck, bare wrists, bare collarbone. A deliberate absence. She arrived at 7:15. Not fashionably late, not anxiously early. Exactly when she meant to. A quiet young woman named Sasha, who worked event security, and who handed Victoria a small earpiece with the practiced ease of someone passing a business card. Victoria slipped it in while pretending to check her phone and made her way to the bar. She ordered the burgundy. She looked out over the room. And there, on the arm of her husband, who had apparently not gone to Calgary, was Renee Thibault, in a gown the color of winter ice and pinned at her shoulder, with a kind of thoughtless elegance that made Victoria's chest go briefly cold, was the sapphire and gold lapel pin. Margaret's pin. Her pin. She set down her champagne flute. She had known it might be there. She had prepared for it. But knowing a thing in the abstract and seeing it across a ballroom, worn by a woman who had no idea what she was carrying, that was its own experience. Victoria allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of pure feeling. Then she went to work. The plan was not complicated. It was precise. There is a difference. Her first call was to the Foundation's event director, a longtime ally named Bertram Cole, who owed her several favors and knew better than to ask questions. She asked him to ensure that the silent auction display, a long table near the east corridor, would be repositioned slightly to create a natural flow of foot traffic toward the garden terrace. He said it would be done. Her second call was to Sasha, through the earpiece. She described what Renee was wearing and asked to be notified when Renee moved toward the terrace. Then, Victoria did something that was perhaps the most disciplined thing she had done all evening. She went to find Preston. He was near the bar with 2 men from a financial firm she recognized. When he saw her, something went briefly across his face. A rearrangement, a recalibration, the particular expression of a man computing distance and cover simultaneously. He covered it within 2 seconds. She gave him credit for that. Victoria. He leaned in and kissed her cheek. I thought you might be here. I'm always here, she said pleasantly. Where else would I be? She stayed for exactly 8 minutes. She was warm, composed, slightly distracted in the way of someone with a full social schedule. She told the men about a new acquisition she was advising on, a collection of early Canadian abstract work. Genuinely interesting, and she watched Preston slowly stop holding his breath. That was important. She needed him relaxed. She needed him to believe she didn't know. When she excused herself, she felt his eyes on her back until she turned the corner. René Thibault moved toward the garden terrace at 8:47. Victoria followed at a distance of about 30 feet, then slipped through the side door that led out ahead of her. By the time René stepped onto the terrace, Victoria was already there, standing at the stone railing, looking out over Front Street, appearing, for all the world, like a woman who simply needed a moment of air. It's beautiful, isn't it? Victoria said, without turning around. The city at night from up here. You can see why people fall in love with Toronto. René stopped. Oh, yes, absolutely. She moved toward the railing, leaving a polite distance. Victoria turned, and she let her gaze move at a party, the way anyone's gaze moves at a party. She held the pause just long enough for René to notice. Her voice was completely even. Victorian. Edwardian, isn't it? Sapphires in that particular cushion cut, you don't see that often. René touched the pin with one hand, a small reflex. Thank you, it was a gift. It was, Victoria said, and then, gently, conversationally, as though she were commenting on the weather. From my husband. The silence on that terrace lasted about 4 seconds. Victoria counted them. René turned to look at her. Her face was very still, the kind of stillness that precedes understanding. I'm sorry, you're Preston Ashford. You're wearing his wife's lapel pin. Victoria's tone did not change. It was not cruel, it was not theatrical, it was simply factual. The way an art historian states a provenance. It was given to me by his mother before she passed. There are initialed hallmarks on the back clasp if you'd like to look. She watched the moment land. René looked down at the pin. Her hand went to it again, not reflexively this time, but with a kind of dawning horror. She turned it over as far as she could without removing it, and Victoria knew she'd found the hallmarks because the color left her face. I didn't know, René said. Her voice was barely above a murmur. I believe you, Victoria said, and she did. I'm not here to humiliate you. I want you to know that. Then what? I'm going to ask you to give me the pin, quietly. Right now, out here where no one needs to see. You can tell me you've caught your heel on your hem or that you're warm or nothing at all. And then you can decide what to do with the rest of your evening. René stood very still for a moment. Then, without another word, she reached up and unclasped the pin from her shoulder. She held it out. Victoria took it. The gold was warm from René's skin. Thank you, Victoria said, and she meant it. René looked at her for a moment with an expression that was hard to name, something between mortification and a strange, reluctant respect. Then she turned and went back inside. Victoria stood alone on the terrace for a minute. She looked at the pin in her palm. The sapphires caught the light from the windows, that same deep, still blue they'd always had, unhurried, unchanged. For when you need to remember, you belong somewhere. She pinned it to her dress, just below her left collarbone. Then she took a breath, rolled her shoulders back, and went inside. The moment was choreographed, but not by Victoria, by the event itself, which had its own logic. The foundation president, Gordon Beauchamp, had been circling her all evening for a photograph for the foundation's annual report. She'd been gently deflecting. At 9:15, she stopped deflecting. She found Gordon near the photographer, touched his arm, said she had a moment if he did. He lit up the way patrons always lit up when Victoria Ashford agreed to something. She gave her name and her attention sparingly, which made both more valuable. The photographer positioned them. The flash went. In the photograph, which would appear in the foundation report, in the society column of a national newspaper, and, within 48 hours, on approximately 11 Instagram accounts, Victoria Ashford stood with her chin slightly lifted and her shoulders square, wearing a midnight blue gown, her mother's pearls, and a small gold and sapphire lapel pin at her left collarbone. She looked like exactly what she was. A woman who had built something, who knew where she stood, who was not going anywhere. Preston saw the photograph on his phone at 11:20 that night. She knew because she was sitting at the vanity in their room at the Fairmont. She'd booked a suite months earlier, an old habit, a practical one. When his call came through, she let it go to voicemail. He left no message. The morning was clear and cold in the way of early Toronto Springs, when the sky is bright but the air still has an edge to it, a reminder that winter is only recently behind you. Victoria ordered coffee from room service and sat in the window of the suite and watched the lake. Lake Ontario in March has a particular quality, flat and gray and immense, completely indifferent to anything happening on its shores. She had an 8 o'clock meeting with her lawyer, David Park, who had been working with her financial forensics team for the past 3. They had been quiet and thorough, and what they had found was neither a surprise nor a small thing. Over the preceding 4 years, Preston had moved money steadily, incrementally, with a careful patience that might have impressed her if it hadn't been directed at her destruction. Shell accounts. A private holding company registered in a name she didn't recognize. Transfers that individually looked like nothing, and collectively added up to something close to $2 million. He had been planning to leave, not just personally, financially. He had been building a separate life, brick by invisible brick, and the plan, as best as David could reconstruct it, had been to complete the asset transfer before asking for a divorce, leaving Victoria to contest what she could prove and recover what she could chase. It was, she had to admit, a fairly sophisticated scheme, but Preston had always been good with structures. She was better. The forensics report had been filed with her litigation team. The proceeds of crime documentation was, as of 2 days prior, with the appropriate authorities. She had moved quietly and completely, the way she'd moved in all things that mattered. Preston Ashford would spend the next several months in the company of very expensive lawyers, and they would not be enough. She called her sister in Ottawa that afternoon, Helena, 5 years younger, the person who knew her best and asked the fewest questions when questions weren't needed. Helena answered on the second ring. "I saw the photograph," Helena said immediately. Victoria smiled. "Did it come out well? You look like you own the room." "I do own the room. I'm on the board." Helena laughed, the real kind, unguarded. "Are you okay?" Victoria considered the question honestly, the way she always did with Helena. Outside the window, a ferry was moving across the water toward the island, small and steady in all that gray. "I'm better than okay," she said. "I think I just needed to remember what that feels like." "And the pin?" Victoria looked at it, sitting on the beside it, had her coffee. The sapphires, still and deep. "It's home," she said, "where it belongs. There is something people don't tell you about, the moment, after a long fight, the specific kind of quiet that follows when you've held yourself together for so long that steadiness became automatic, became reflex, became who you are. You expect relief. Sometimes you get it, but more often what you get is this. A clear, still feeling like that lake outside the window, flat and honest, and somehow larger than you remembered. Victoria Ashford did not walk away from her marriage with nothing. She walked away with a forensic paper trail, a litigation team that David Park called the best he'd ever assembled, and a pin that her mother-in-law had placed in her hands on a rainy afternoon in November in a kitchen that smelled of pine and old wood, with a look that said, "I see you. I know who you are. Don't forget." She didn't forget. She had never, in the end, forgotten anything. Preston Ashford's lawyers filed for a negotiated settlement 8 months later, with conditions his team described as generous and her team described as a starting point. His application to the Financial Regulatory Board, a board he'd sat on for 6 years, was quietly declined that same week. Renee Thibault, for what it's worth, cooperated fully with the investigators. She had not known about the marriage, not known about the pin, not known about the money. She provided a signed statement and was neither charged nor named publicly. Victoria had asked that her name be kept out of it. She had meant what she said on the terrace. She wasn't there to humiliate anyone. She was simply there to take back what was hers, and she did. That's the story for tonight, and honestly, I keep thinking about that terrace scene, that moment where she could have done it so many other ways, could have made it loud, made it public, made it hurt, and she just didn't. She chose something harder, quieter, more permanent. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell me what city you're watching from, and tell me what you think Victoria should have said to Preston when he finally called, and subscribe to Velvet Echoes if you haven't already. Next week's story involves a family estate in Nova Scotia, a will that wasn't what anyone expected, and one sister who knew exactly what was coming. You won't want to miss it.